Hello, everyone. It is Dr. Z. This is World War II, Part 5, last part. We're going to talk about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the end of the war itself and some big takeaways. So, by July 1945, Germany had surrendered and the war in Europe was over, as we talked about in the last video. Japan, however, refused to submit to the terms outlined by the Allies' Potsdam Declaration, and it appeared to American leaders that the only way to compel Japan's unconditional surrender was to invade and conquer the Japanese home islands. In 1945, U.S. forces headed forward in the Central Pacific as combat reached even bloodier crescendos. On Iwo Jima, Marines achieved a costly victory as they grappled with the tenacious Japanese defenders who had dug into the island's volcanic terrain. Americans faced even worse in Okinawa, the natural springboard for the invasion of Japan's home islands. In Okinawa's craggy southern reaches, U.S. soldiers and Marines battered a Japanese fortress as kamikaze aircraft rained down on the invasion fleet. The celebration erupted when the first Marine patrol reached the summit of Mount Suribachi, as seen here on Iwo Jima on February 23rd, 1945, and raised a small American flag. A short while later, another detachment returned to the peak to replace the flag with a second larger one. An AP photographer was there, Joe Rosenthal. He captured the moment on film. Although his second flag raising was hardly noticed on Iwo Jima, Rosenthal's dramatic photograph appeared on the front pages of newspapers around the country and became one of World War II's most iconic images. On the right is the U.S. aircraft carrier Bunker Hill that is burning and in flames, as you see there in the picture, after being hit by two kamikaze planes within 30 seconds during the Battle of Okinawa in May of 1945. The victory at Okinawa cost more than 49,000 American casualties, including about 12,000 deaths. About 90,000 Japanese combatants died in the fighting, but the deaths among Okinawan civilians may have reached 150,000. So, at least 110 Japanese soldiers and more than 100,000 Okinawan civilians, a third of the island's pre-war population, perished in the American campaign in Japan, and American casualties in Okinawa weighed heavily on the minds of American planners who looked ahead to the invasion of Japan itself. And Japan's leaders had hoped to prevail not by defeating American forces, but by inflicting massive casualties and thereby breaking the resolve of the American public. This was the situation that was confronted by the American president Harry Truman in the summer of 1945 when he authorized the use of the world's first atomic bomb. In the minutes, hours, and days that followed the bombing, survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki tried desperately to locate loved ones and care for the thousands of wounded. Some people exhibited horrible burns, as seen in the picture here, while others were outwardly appeared unscathed, but later died painful deaths from radiation poisoning. Thousands of people were buried in the debris of their homes. Most structures in the city had been constructed of wood and tile roofs, and all but a handful of concrete structures in the city had been completely leveled. And the National World War II Museum has excellent pages and accounts of these horrific actions, and I do encourage you to visit their website for more information. So all of this is to say that with the development of nuclear weapons that was being undertaken by not just the United States, but also the UK, Canada, Germany, Japan, and the USSR in World War II, the United States, though, was the first and the only country to use a nuclear weapon in war. Okay. And when Germany lost the war and Japan lost the war, they both ceased to be involved in any nuclear weapons research afterwards for obvious reasons. In August 1949, the USSR, though, tested a nuclear weapon, and the United Kingdom tested a nuclear weapon in 1952. France developed one in 1960. China detonated one in 1964. India exploded one in 1974, and Pakistan tested one in 1998. And in 2006, North Korea also conducted a nuclear test. And there are many maps online of the nuclear proliferation in the world, and sort of, one of the big wakes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is the Cold War that we experienced, and some would argue are still living within. Switching gears, our key concept outline asked us to talk about women in World War II. Women were highly involved in many different ways in the war. An example that your key concept outline would like you to understand is in Finland, the Lata Svard. They were nurses. They signaled for air raids. They organized rationing. They organized hospital work. They did volunteer military auxiliary work, but they never fired guns, unlike the Russians. Women in Nazi Germany were many, as we talked about before, many Nazis were required to work. 51% of women of working age worked in the workforce, and some even served as guards in the lager system, many at Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was a camp for women. In 1939, all single women had mandatory work assignments in Nazi Germany, and the female auxiliaries in the military were approximately 500,000 women, and also about 500,000 women served as either secretaries for the Nazis, or were wives of SS officers, or nurses in the euthanasia program. The U.S. National Holocaust Museum shows us a photograph of a woman who served as a euthanasia nurse, taken by an American military photographer. So women in Nazi Germany, there's been a lot of scholarship about, people who worked, not like how the Nazis got people to work for them, how people supported the Nazis in many different ways. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in class, but, it's not just, I think what the AP gods want you to think about is that Nazis weren't just men, but they were women too. British women also worked in World War II. The British government website tells us that with thousands of men away serving the armed forces, British women took on a variety of jobs. They played a vital role on the home front. They, of course, ran households and fought in the daily battle of rationing, recycling, reusing, and cultivating food in allotments and gardens. But from 1941 on, women were called up for war work in roles such as mechanics, engineers, munition workers, air raid wardens, bus and fire engine drivers. In U.S. history, you studied the concept of Rosie the Riveter. Here we have the Queen of England, who was then Princess Elizabeth, right, serving as an ambulance driver. At first, only single women worked in Great Britain. Between ages of 20 and 30 were called up, but by 1943, almost 90% of single women and 80% of married women were working in factories or on the land or in the armed forces. There were over 640,000 women in the armed forces. It including the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Plus many more who flew unarmed aircraft, drove ambulances, served as nurses, worked behind enemy lines in the European resistance, and in special operations executive. And also, there were 80,000 women who were part of what was called the Women's Land Army, enduring tough conditions and long hours in isolated rural outposts of Great Britain to prevent Britain from being starved out. These were women who worked on farms. They were known as land girls. You see a photograph or a painting here depicting their training in a dairy. They were given a uniform. They had to live on the farms where they were sent to work. So overall, the reasons for Allied victory, your key concept outline wants you to understand that American, British industrial, scientific, and technological power and the all-out military commitment of the USSR were the reasons for Allied victories in World War II. They also want you to understand that World War II caused a complete destruction of a generation of Russian and German men, virtually destroyed European Jews, resulting in the murder of millions of other groups targeted by the Nazis, including the Roma, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and others. And also, the war forced large-scale migrations and undermined pre-war class hierarchies. These are all things that we will be talking about as we look at the post-war era in our next lessons. In the aftermath, the Allies formed the United Nations in 1945. Of course, there are now two major global powers, the United States and the USSR, and they form large spheres of influence. And this causes what is called the Iron Curtain to descend. It's a proverbial sort of metaphor for the line between the West and the East, partitioning the Allied and occupied parts of Germany. The United States also occupies Japan. Korea becomes divided. The Korean War is to come. NATO and the Warsaw Pact military alliances begin the Cold War and decolonization as well. And those things lead to, general ideas of self-determination, a number of some peaceful decolonization actions, but also a number of wars, for example, in Algeria, and the creation of Israel and the division of India and Pakistan. So we have a lot to talk about as we move forward. The post-war world is a complicated one, so stay tuned. All right, thank you.